To start off, one of the changes we've made to the system is we've upgraded a number of the sort of domain value pages, specifically the ones that where there are values that you can edit yourself, which basically means that they're organization-specific values. So for example, if I pull up the analytical methods page, it has a slightly different look at this point. One advantage is just that it not only just looks and behaves like many of our other pages within WQX Web, but also it's lighter weight and opens more quickly, and so it performs a little better. And if you do pull up a list, for example, I'm just pulling up the analytical methods for WQX test to simulate what it'd be like if you were editing your own analytical methods within your organization. Once you pull up the list here, you have the ability to delete records if for some reason they're not used. You can also edit data just by clicking within a cell and changing the value. So if I needed to make a change, it's as simple as just clicking in the box and clicking Save. So the basic interface is similar to other pages. There's paging if that's needed. There's a count of the number of records that are included. So it's just more consistent with the rest of the application. And that's true of all the other domain value pages that are in this initial menu. Another change we've made is a number of the review pages. So for example, if you're just trying to review your activities or results within WQX, just to get sort of a QA check to make sure that the data that you believe is in WQX is legitimately there. We've added some new search criteria to the result page, as well as the activity page and the metrics page. So those are the activity media, the biological intent, and there's a sampling component search criteria as well. So if, for example, I just wanted to do a spot check for, say, the population census data that I had loaded, you know, I could simply do a search, maybe add a date range in, and quickly do a quick spot check on the population census data within WQX. Another advantage or enhancement we've made to the page is the Excel to export feature. Works basically the same as before, but it does perform better, downloads more quickly than it used to. So if you are looking at a list of results that you have queried, you can just click the Export to Excel button. It'll download a file that you can then open, and it's fairly straightforward. It'll provide you the basic information that you were looking at in the list. Another change we made to the system is with respect to importing or exporting in the system. So if for example, I were to import a file, and let's say I've got a file that's a half decent size here. So let me pick a file that I want to import. And when I start importing, there's now a new progress bar that shows up here that will basically show me not only the status, but once it begins importing, then you'll see a % complete and an estimated time remaining. And this page will continue to track the progress and update every handful of seconds or so to show you the progress of your import. The other advantage is this page used to refresh every few seconds, and it was, sort of would flicker, and so this is a little smoother, a little nicer. But besides just sort of the visual, aspect of this progress bar, it has some other advantages as well. One is that if we leave the page, for example, I'm noticing here I have a bunch of errors. So if I leave the page to just review my log of errors while this is importing, it will continue to show me the progress of my import up in this upper right corner up here by the logout button. So as I'm navigating around the system, if I have a file that's importing, I can continue to see its progress while I do other things. So certainly one advantage is just the ability to continue to do other things and see the progress. But it has some other advantages as well. One thing is that the progress bar is regularly basically polling the server to ask for an update of the status of that import. And what that does is also sort of reminds the server that you have an import that's processing and make sure that it keeps the WQX web application running on the server. So one aspect to web applications in many cases is that if users aren't actively using the system, the web server will shut down the application just to conserve resources on the server. And so there have been some cases in the past where people have had large imports. Maybe they take several hours to import, and they would log out of the system or leave the page where they're importing, and at some point the server would determine that no one was using the system, shut down WQX web, and your import would basically hang and would no longer continue. So this has the benefit of trying to just keep the server alive while your file loads, and it also keeps your session alive so that you won't get automatically logged out while a file is importing. The only thing to sort of remind you there is that if you are importing or exporting a large file, it is highly recommended that you just leave your browser open while that's loading, because otherwise you won't get the benefits of sort of that guarantee that the server will continue to process your file. So just a reminder to keep the browser open while files are importing. Another change we made to the system is with respect to the datasets page. So if I'm looking here at, say, my datasets that are files that I've imported or in the process of importing or exporting, you'll notice now there are icons on the page that basically highlight information about the status of your different datasets. So as you can see, there's 4 or 5 different icons that sort of highlight the status, and these are more than just trying to add some style to the page, but they're also hopefully helpful in reminding people of sort of the multiple steps that are used in importing and submitting data to WQX. And so as you can see here, we have an icon specifically for importing. We'll notice there's a couple of data sets that have a status of imported. Some have an exclamation point, and some have this sort of little yield symbol. And this is really distinguishes between a file that's imported successfully in the sense that it didn't crash, but there were errors that were logged. So in this case, if I wanted to review my errors, I simply go in and take a look at the page, and then I can review my errors. And so just to jump back very briefly, the other icon, sort of this green check mark, is really highlighting the fact that a data submission or a data set is only completed once it has been submitted to CDX, or once the WQX system has been updated. And so there's actually multiple steps in that process. You need to import a file, and then if there's no errors, you need to submit that file to WQX or to CDX, which is the Central Data Exchange. And then once that file's been processed successfully, it gets a final status of completed or failed. And so these icons are just to try to remind you of the various stages of that process and the ones that are completed successfully. If you are looking at a page, for example, we've also provided some new information that's in this sort of little message box here off to the side. And this has been around in some form or another for many years, but we've significantly changed the content and the look of that box to make it more helpful, particularly to new users. So there's information here. For example, this is just reminding you that this is a multi-step process, and that once you complete the import, there are other steps to complete. And likewise, if we look at some of the other pages, for example, if we have errors, it's sort of reminding you that you've imported, but you need to resolve your errors either by correcting them in the system or by correcting them in your file and re-importing them. And likewise, if we've gotten sort of to this stage of the process that it's imported successfully without errors, then the message box changes to yellow to sort of suggest the middle step, and it reminds you that you need to submit your data to CDX to finalize it. And then once you have completed a submission to CDX successfully, then it sort of gives you this green reminder box to let you know that everything's completed successfully and you're done with the process. So the message boxes and the icons are just to try to help make the process a little more clear and what the steps are. Particularly useful to newer users that are less familiar with the system. Some other changes we've made to the system are in our import configurations. So if I go to our Setup Import Configurations menu, I'll see a list of any import configurations that I've created or that I have access to. So for example, if I just click the Add New button because I want to create a new import configuration, and if I'm just creating one from scratch for my results and my activities, there's a few sort of minor layout changes to point out. One fairly minor one is we've just consolidated all the buttons off to the left side here. So in the previous version there was a button or two that was sort of out here in the list, particularly this pick list button. We've just moved them all to the left to be a little more consistent and concise. Another change we've made is with respect to the pick list for the elements. So elements are essentially the fields that exist within WQX that you can map to your import file to load it. And so if we look at, for example, let's say I just wanted to add some additional elements to my import configuration. If I click the Add New button, I then get a sort of a tree structure here for the elements. It's a little different than the previous version. And up at the top there's a plus and minus button that will basically shrink the list or expand the list to show all of the elements. And basically, as far as just terminology, these sort of groupings of elements we typically refer to them as entities within WQX Web. So these are sort of the records or types of records that can be loaded into the system in this particular type of file. So in this case, this is an activity and results file, and so it's sort of broken up all the various fields or elements into this tree structure. And if I click on one of these boxes, then I can open up and see the elements that are available within that entity or that group. So for example, another thing that's sort of useful to remember is that most of these entities are things that in many cases can exist more than once in your file. So for example, maybe you have a result, an activity and result on a row of your file, but maybe you want to provide two sets of detection limits. Maybe you want to provide a method detection level and an upper quantitation limit, for example. If you were to select these additional elements here, for example, under result detection limit and click OK, then in my file I'll now see that those three elements have been added into this position in my import configuration, but also you'll notice that I already had these detection limits in my file previously, and so now I've basically got result detection limit number 1, which are these columns here, and result detection limit number 2, which are these columns here. So it's just a slightly more efficient way to pick your elements and to maybe have a little better understanding of the structure of import files and how some of these elements relate to each other. Another change that we've made to the import configuration page is in the previous version of WQX Web, there was an expert mode button here at the top. And now in this version of WQX Web, we have a bunch of additional options, and so we've just consolidated that expert mode in with a number of other options that are available on import configuration. So if you click on this options button, you then have a number of things where you can check the box to enable that option in your import configuration. And the first one, which is expert mode for import configuration, is basically equivalent of that expert mode button that existed in the previous version of WQX Web. But also we've added a number of other options. So one of them is expert mode for translations, which this allows some more complex comparison options and expressions in your translations. And that's something we'll go over in just a moment. There's also a new option to generate an activity ID. So this is something that many users have asked for. As many of you experienced users are aware, it can be challenging to come up with a unique ID for each activity that you import into the system. And so this is a feature that will basically take care of that for you. There are some caveats to that, or some explanation on how that's done. Essentially, it will take your monitoring location ID and your activity date, activity time, that's the activity start date and start time, and the activity type, or rather an abbreviation for the type, and it will then concatenate or merge those four pieces of information into one field and use that as your activity ID. So this in many cases, or in most cases, is a successful way to generate an activity ID. The one thing to keep in mind there is if you do want to use that feature, it's highly recommended that you always provide an activity time. So if you're an organization that just loads a date and not the time, then this feature may not work as well for you unless you literally only collect one type of sample at a particular site on a particular day. Otherwise, we really recommend you include the time to help make those activity IDs unique. If I check that box, basically it just makes a minor change to my import configuration. For example, at this point, it moved my activity ID up into this generated values section, which basically means it's not something we're going to import, it's going to be generated for me. And then just kind of a reminder here in the box that this is automatic. It's not something you need to populate. In fact, it's locked so you can't change it, but the system will generate your activity ID for you. To briefly go over some of the other new options, there's also an option to generate a detection condition and detection limits, or detection and quantitation limits, from the result value that you provide. Now, just to clarify, that is only going to be looking at results that have a greater than or less than symbol in them. But this is certainly something that some labs do, provide a value that's got a greater than or less than symbol to represent something that is potentially above or below quantification limit. And so if you have a scenario like that, it has generally been the recommendation of EPA to, rather than putting that value in your result value field, to represent it with a detection condition. For example, you would indicate that you have something present above quantification limit, and then you would put that value in as the upper quantitation limit. And so this will basically take care of that step for you if you wish to have that conversion done automatically. And just checking that box will basically take care of that task and make that conversion for you. The final one is somewhat related, but it's to populate the detection limit unit from the result unit. So in some cases, you may have a file where the lab has a column for your result units, but in creating your detection limits, rather than having to create an additional column and try to copy that value over, you can just tell the system that if it doesn't have a a measurement unit for your detection limit, to just take it from the result unit field and assume that they're the same. And likewise, if you do check this box, once you click say or OK, it actually will select this for you because it's actually something the system needs to be able to accurately and correctly generate your detection limits for you. So those are some nice new features that I think will come in handy for a number of users. Save some time and make it a little simpler to import your files and get over some challenges that have sometimes been difficult in the past.